You did a great job last time.
Oh, okay. Yes, I'm Matthew Edlund. I run the Center for Circadian Medicine in Sarasota, Florida. I'm also the director of the Gulf Coast Sleep Institute. And yes, I do talk like a New Yorker, which is where I was born. Trained Amherst College, State University of New York, Downstate Medical School. We tried to change the name, but the president of the university really didn't think that was a good idea. We thought something that would be more descriptive of where we actually worked, like East Flatbush Medical Center. But that just didn't fly. Then I've trained in internal medicine, University of California, San Diego, Massachusetts General Hospital, occupational health at Harvard, psychiatry at NYU Bellevue. Anybody ever been to Bellevue?
Weekly.
Weekly, okay. Yeah, the joke about Bellevue used to be that if you wanted to work there, you sort of had to be in for a couple of weeks. Yeah, so I did a psychiatry residency there. And then I taught at the University of Texas, Houston for a while, doing the biology of anxiety, which I regarded as my birthright as a New Yorker. Moved from there to Brown to run a division there. And that's when I got heavily involved in sleep medicine. And I actually realized that you could make a living at it, which shocked me, and that you didn't have to stay up all night, which is what I thought you had to do if you're going to do sleep medicine. But it turns out the technicians stay up all night. So I was able to avoid that. The book that came out this year that I've done is my 5th book. It's called The Power of Rest. And that's some of what I'm going to be talking about today. But what I'm really talking about is how the body works. And the body works, fascinatingly enough, through regeneration. We literally remake ourselves all the time. And if you want to visualize what this is like, I don't have my trusty acorn with me today, but we know that an acorn turns into an oak tree. What we don't realize is that we do the same thing ourselves, just internally. And that in fact, life is really fast. How fast? Okay, perhaps your hearts are fluttering a little bit faster now that you've been able to sit down and get some coffee. But if you look at the pumping proteins that are keeping you alive right now, they're built, used, destroyed, recycled in 60 to 90 minutes. And outside of things like the valves of your heart, most of your heart essentially gets replaced in about 3 days. Now, I've often asked my hard drive of this computer to replace itself in 3 days or even 6 days. It just won't do it. I can't even get my car engine to replace itself in 3 days or a week. That's what we do. The process is astonishingly quick. And this X-ray really does tell the story. If you look at what most of a human being has left after about 4 weeks, many cases 3 weeks, we've got our bones, we've got our teeth, we've got the lens of the eye, we've got bits of DNA, and there are nice cytoskeletal proteins around, but basically most of you is gone. So has anybody here ever woken up in the morning, looked in the mirror and said, "That's not me"? Has that ever happened? I guess maybe one. The fact is, that literally is true. That's not you. You've changed through the night. Your brain has been rebuilt. Your brain has been rewired. Large parts of you have been renewed. That's what's happening every day. That's how our bodies live. So, unlike the way we normally live, where we work with machines, we start to think of ourselves as being machines, as things that sort of decay. I mean, sometimes we'll rapidly decay and sometimes we slowly decay, but our image of ourselves is that we sort of hit a peak in our youth and then sort of slowly, rapidly decline. That's not true at all. By the time we've gotten into our 60s and 70s, we have replaced most of us hundreds of times, thousands of times. And if you want to realize what illness is all about, illness is not the decay of the machine. Illness is a block of the renewal. Something has happened where that renewal is stopped, delayed, corrupted, and whether it's osteoarthritis in your fingers, a tumor, a cold, something happens where that renewal process does not work. So the real trick in terms of staying healthy is not just to regenerate yourself, but to keep that renewal process going as much as possible so that everything does keep working. And when it doesn't, and when we do have arthritis, and when we do have spinal stenosis, and when we do have diabetes, that's when we're stuck talking to doctors. Because those are big bottlenecks that we have to get around. Now, the book The Information just came out by James Gleick. Anybody know about that? James Gleick was a science writer for the New York Times for a very long time. But this book is basically arguing that what really matters in life, in the universe, is information. And if you look at what's happening in physics now, which is now bleeding into biology, the idea is that everything is information, including the universe. If you'll talk to physicists, they will talk about quantum information theory. They will talk about how things are not mass energy, but matters of information. Now, obviously, the human body is an incredibly vast information system. We have to process information, we have to forget it or remember it. That's what we do. But if you think of it this way, people are used to using the net, right? Okay. That basically is a giant information network. One of the ways you can view your body also is that of a giant information network. But one that you have a lot of control over. And that information network works based on what you do. Everything you do becomes an event that changes that system, even the cell phone that she has. This is just distinct proof that information really is physical. So what I'm going to try and do is give you some ideas of how all this works in the sense of a roadmap, that the stuff that affects how your body regenerates is, in a sense, a key to how to do that. Okay. Now, there's two simple questions that you can ask yourself when you wake up in the morning or when you get around during the day. One, what did my human body evolve to do? Did I evolve to eat lots of chocolate donuts and sit in front of a TV set? Or an even more interesting question, which is, what can I do every minute of every day or every hour of every day that'll help regenerate my body? And what I'm going to try to do now is give you some of the keys of that roadmap, just some, so you have some idea of where you can do this yourself. There are lots of benefits to this. Does anybody know about the 8 Americas study? Okay, that was devised by a guy named Chris Murray, who used to be at Harvard. He was taken by Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation over to the University of Washington. And he was looking at the whole US population and trying to figure out who lives and who doesn't and what are the characteristics of them. So where are the longest lived people in the world? Russia. Any other places? No Ecuadorians, no Abkhazians, no... Actually, it turns out the longest lived subpopulations in the world are in metropolitan New York City. That's subtropical paradise. And the group are Asian American women. And the group of Asian American women in Suffolk County have an expected lifespan of 95.6 years. Small group. The group out in Bergen County, which is usually more famous for corruption and being a cancer hotspot, their expected lifespan is 91.1 years in a group that's generally has a much lower lifespan. So folks, it's not the toxic environment of the United States that's the reason why we're 49th in the world in lifespan. It's how we live. It's our lifestyle. And it turns out that of the Asian American women, those born in the US are living 5 years longer than their mothers born overseas. You can do it here. And you can do it under circumstances that involve the most ordinary activities in the world. Okay. Now I'm going to try and make the argument to you that food really is information, especially now that you're eating. It's fuel, it's energy, it's materials, but it's also information. For example, if you want to gain weight, should you eat more in the morning or at night? At night, that's right. Body clocks strongly affect what happens to people, even when their voices go out. Because all these keys to the roadmap in terms of information affect each other. Okay, now, if you're in a blue room or a red room, where will people eat more? Red. Right. In fact, they'll eat about a third more than they will in a blue room. Okay. Now, does sequence matter? Does it matter whether you have your dessert at the beginning of the meal or your dessert at the end of the meal? No? Matters quite a lot. Yeah. If you take in quite a lot of glucose at the beginning, if you have a really sugary meal, it's actually going to increase your metabolic rate, and it's going to cause digestion to be quite different. You effectively will ingest more calories that way. There's even data out there that when you eat foods will change how the liver takes care of all the proteins that come out in terms of producing procarcinogens and producing carcinogens. For example, if you take Brussels sprouts earlier in the meal, you're going to get a whole bunch of different procarcinogens popping out of the liver than if you have it late in the meal. Even sequence of meals makes a difference. That's why people think of food as, you know, diet should be simple. Diet is not simple. Not only are we different person to person, not only does our food change where we eat it, how we eat it, who we eat it with, when we eat it, it's also going to change based on what we do afterward. And one of the things I'm going to try and talk about, especially if my computer decides to wake up again, is activity makes a big difference both before and after a meal, but particularly after a meal. So everything we do is an information event. Now, what works? Do people here read Michael Pollan? Mm-hmm. Right. I'm quite fond of Michael Pollan. I really do think there's a major difference between whole foods and the industrial foods that we normally eat. And his food rules really make great sense. I mean, for example, when you read something like, if a food has the same name in every language, it's an industrial product and not a food, like Le Big Mac. Or if a food is handed to you through the window of your car, it's an industrial product and not a food. But there's some basic things about foods, and whole foods really do make sense because of that first question before. What did humans evolve to eat? And basically we evolved to eat a lot of fibrous plant stuffs because that's what was around. We also love salt, sugar, and fat because they're critical to life. And for a large part of our evolution, were probably very hard to obtain. So in terms of salt, we need about 70 to 90 milligrams. The average American diet has about 4,000. As they say in the trade, nothing succeeds like excess. Okay. Now what diets work? A lot of different diets work, especially in terms of all the other things I'm going to talk about. And the East Asian diets seem to work very well to get on to the issue of Okinawa until you looked at Asian American populations in the United States. The longest lived people in the world were Okinawans, Okinawan women. And there's some very interesting data there in terms of Alzheimer's disease, because there are projects like the Okinawa Project which look at women who have lived to be 100, males, those rare cases who have lived to be 100. And then they biopsy their brains after they died. And when you go to Okinawa and you look at the centenarians, you will find that when you biopsy their brains, they show Alzheimer's changes all over the place. They have Alzheimer's plaques, they have neurofibrillary tangles. If you show it to a neuropathologist, the neuropathologist is going to say, this is awful, these people have terrible Alzheimer's disease. And most of them didn't show it clinically. Why? Their arteries are clean. Their arteries are patent. That's where lifestyle has such a big impact on these things. So a lot of people in this part of the world are concerned about dementia for many reasons, but a very critical factor is keeping your arteries clean. That's why diabetes is a problem. That's why atherosclerosis is a problem. That's why blood pressure is a problem. All of which are related to having more Alzheimer's disease. Activity is probably the one guaranteed fountain of youth that's available to most of us. But the interesting part is that activity counts everywhere. There's a thing called NEATS. Anybody ever hear of NEATS? No? Okay. Non-exercise associated thermogenesis. What I'm doing now, standing up. Okay? NEATS are a way of getting exercise without thinking that you're exercising. And the guy who studies this, who's a professor at Mayo, actually has a treadmill desk. Yes, he types on his treadmill desk and he walks at 0.7 miles an hour as he types. He's quite thin. The story really is this. Everything counts. Talking, moving, standing. Standing takes about 25% more energy than sitting. And sitting actually is a risk factor for a lot of illnesses. And in terms of how much activity do we really need, given that humans are walking machines, it's amazing how little activity we really need to stay healthy. To maximize lifespan, you're talking 60 to 90 minutes activity a day. That doesn't mean running to the gym. That doesn't mean going on the Stairmaster. That means walking. That means doing housework. That means doing yard work. It's like 6–7% of the time that we're actually awake. It's a remarkably small amount of time. Okay. Then one of my favorite topics, that of rest. Rest is usually applied in this society as a passive waste of time. You know, why do I need to sleep? You know, what's the point? The truth is that rest is where a huge part of that regeneration is taking place. And the reason I wrote The Power of Rest, well, the first reason was that I saw a lot of people coming into my office who were ill, in many cases who were close to death, and who had totally preventable illnesses. And there were so many things I figured that if they had done differently, could have prevented that. But the second reason is that our idea of rest is completely wrong. Rest is not passive. Rest is extraordinarily active. And there's different kinds of rest. There's physical rest, there's mental rest, there's social rest, there's spiritual rest, all of which can help regenerate body and mind. And when I was writing The Power of Rest, people said to me, you're joking, I'm not going to rest. You know, what do you mean, take naps? I mean, give me a break. I said, if I can give you techniques that you can do in 30 to 60 seconds, will you do it? And people said, yeah, I think I'll do that. And that's why The Power of Rest is filled with dozens of techniques like that. And some people know them. They know things like deep breathing. But then there are other things like paradoxical relaxation, which is my favorite, because it just seems a great idea to relax by not relaxing. As a New Yorker, I just think that's a wonderful thought. And if you like, at the end of this, I'll try and teach people how to do paradoxical relaxation, because it's actually very quick. But there are all these different kinds of rest, and if you use them, you can not only get a state of relaxed concentration, but you can also get yourself in a much healthier state. Now, my book before this is called The Body Clock Advantage. I spend a lot of my time looking at 24-hour rhythms. Everything changes depending on time of day, and I'm really happy to talk to you at this time because most people don't fall asleep at this time. And even though I make my living as a sleep doctor, this is the time of day that people are most alert. This is the time of day where it is hardest to get people to fall asleep. It's also the time of day where people will tend to hit records in physical activities or exercise or world records in sports. Yeah, everything follows 24-hour cycle. Okay, is there any difference, for example, between having a drink of alcohol, a glass of wine at 6 p.m. or midnight? Any ideas? You would think so. I'll tell you, you better know so. There's about a 2- to 3-fold effect of alcohol in terms of your ability to function psychomotor-wise at midnight as compared with 6 p.m. Many drugs will have 2-, 3-, 4-fold effects depending on what time of day. Do your doctors know this stuff? No. Medicine's complicated enough. This often is beyond them. When do you want to take cholesterol drugs? At night. That's when you make cholesterol. Everything's following a 24-hour rhythm. Okay? Now, what's the peak time of death in the United States? Anybody have an idea? Excuse me? 9 a.m.? Ah, what day of the week? Monday morning. Why is that? No, it actually happens. Work is maybe a part of it, but it actually happens across the board in terms of populations. What happens is very simple, at least theoretically simple. People blow out their body clocks over the weekend. What do? Friday night, we go to bed late. We get up late on Saturday. We go to bed late on Saturday night. Get up late on Sunday. Sunday evening comes. Whole different ballgame. And for a lot of populations, heart attack rates will go up about 5-fold. Okay. That's what body clocks do. If you know how to use your body clocks, for example, in terms of eating, you want to have a big breakfast. You don't want to have a big dinner. Why? You have a lot more baseline insulin when you wake up in the morning. We're prepared to eat. We've been starving through the night. We've wiped out all that glucose in our liver in the form of glycogen. We need new stuff. Okay? And not only are you going to metabolize a meal in approximately half as much time as you will in the evening, but if you have the same meal at night, not only do you have a much greater chance of gaining weight, but you'll have higher glucoses, you'll have higher cholesterol levels. Everything changes. The trick is to make those changes work for you. Okay. The Romans were right. Time rules life. Then there's the issue of social support. Basically, the more friends you have, the more colleagues you have, the more people you know, in many ways, the longer you live. The first study that really showed this was done in Alameda County. It was men and women 40 to 55. This is outside of Berkeley. And they just asked questions like, do you join the Knights of Columbus? Do you go visit your grandmother over the weekend? And the people who did more of that not only had a lot less heart attacks and strokes, but even a few tumors were less. And depression rates were far less. And that study, which was first published in 1979, has been replicated all over the world. And the same results are true. We're social animals. Social connections, like with your cell phone, social connections, even very short ones, matter. The more connected we are, generally, the healthier we are. And even, and believe it or not, the better we sleep. And some people have come to me before this and asked, I have problems with sleep. Strangely enough, happier people do sleep better. Yes, life is not fair. Now, I did say a little bit about sitting, and I know most of you are sitting now, but I really won't be deeply offended if you stand up at the end of this. It turns out that when people sit more than 6 hours, they die faster. And that's more true of women than of men. And if you look at people who work and then go home and, for example, spend a lot of time on their computer, after about 4 hours, and this is studies that have come out of Australia, West Virginia, and a bunch of other places, the overall cardiovascular rates pretty much double when you control for everything else. Yeah?
So that's 6 hour cumulative or 6 hours at a stretch?
6 hour cumulative. So yeah, you really want to stand up when you can. And that's where active rest comes in, because basically you take breaks, you make mistakes. We're not built to be machines. We're not built to sit in the same place and sit there for hours and hours and hours. I mean, Stephen King can do that. Stephen King, before he got ill, used to have a special chair so he could write for 12 hours straight. But Stephen King's an unusual guy. Most of us are really much better off if we can get up and stand. And so if you are in a workplace, go to your coworkers, talk to them for 30 seconds, talk to them for 60 seconds. If you can, get outside and walk at lunch, because there's an incredible amount of things that happen when you do that. Yeah?
Does it make a difference if you're standing, on the computer?
Does it make a difference if you're standing on the computer as opposed to sitting on the computer? Yeah. If you stand, it's going to take about 25% more energy. And as you see, when you're standing, you get to move around a bunch more. And it's generally going to be easier, not just in terms of cardiovascular risk, but for a lot of people it'll be helpful in terms of flexibility. We're not meant to be mollusks. We're not meant to be snails who are stuck in a chair all day. It really helps for us to keep going. Yeah. And I really do have a standing desk at home. Okay. Now, how to put these things together? There's a lot of different ways of doing that. But one of the simplest is simply to remember 3 letters. FAR. Food, activity, rest. Every time you eat, you move. Now, why would you want to do that? I mean, our elementary school teachers told us, you sit and digest your food. It's much better when you sit and digest your food, right? No. It turns out that if you walk after your meal, if you start moving after a meal, you stop digestion, or at least slow it down tremendously. And when you slow digestion down, you don't get those huge glucose peaks, which are followed by huge insulin peaks, which then really add a nice bit of belly fat in there. And why is that a problem? Because belly fat turns out to be an endocrine gland. The fat around your organs actually produces all kinds of hormones, many of which are not good for you. There's real wild combinations of adiponectin and resistin and other things. But basically, the more fat you have around here, the higher your level of atherosclerosis, which is why waist-hip ratios are in many ways much more effective in telling you the lifespan of a population than their body mass index. But don't worry, the US is #1. When it comes to body mass index, we are #1 in the world. Okay. Now, has anybody, yeah?
I just wanted to confirm, you said that if you walk after a meal, that you would have that increase of fat?
No, the opposite. No,
You just
yes.
walk.
What I'm talking about is this. The trick is very simple. Eat, move, rest. Even moving before a meal will in some people help them digest their food more efficiently and actually help around weight control. But moving after a meal is a much bigger deal, because then you're not going to digest that food so rapidly, you're not going to have as much fat deposition. It's much easier to control weight. When I do this with most people, they usually don't change their diets very much, but over a period of months they tend to tell me the same thing. They lose about 12 to 15 pounds if they're at all overweight. It just seems to be the same. I don't know why, but that seems to be the number. And for example, let's say you take a walk after lunch. You walk to a restaurant with a work colleague and you walk back with a work colleague. Think about what's happening. When you're walking outside, you're going to change your digestion. You're going to be using exercise. You're going to be getting social support and social engagement. You're going to be getting sunlight. Sunlight is a drug. Sunlight changes immunity. Sunlight changes mood. Yes, it can cause skin cancer, but there's a whole bunch of other studies that show that certain kinds of tumors, for example, prostate tumors in males, seem to be less when people are out in sunlight more. I just wrote an article about this on my website, Restdoctor.com, about cut your light at night. There's all kinds of effects of light in terms of when you get it, how you get it, where you get it, changing your immunity, changing your mood, changing your activity. So that when you get home, when you get back to work after that, not only have people done things that are very healthy, but you can even show that work productivity has gone up for a lot of those people. That the few minutes that they spent moving around really changed their ability to function in the afternoon, which is a relative dead point for most people's productivity. And most of human attention, awareness, alertness follows body clocks. And when body clocks are rising like they are in the late morning or at this time, people tend to be more alert. In the afternoon, they're flat. That's why we nap. Before electric lights, before gas lights, almost everybody napped. It's a very natural thing to do. Okay. The concept of flow was developed by a guy named Mahai Csikszentmihalyi, and I think his name prevented him from being really famous. Even though he was the chairman of the psychology department at the University of Chicago. And he was looking at peak experiences. He wanted to know, what is it that people really feel when they're feeling good, when they're getting stuff done? And he came up with about 6 different functions. One, people are engrossed, just like you are in this lecture. People don't notice the time. They're not aware of the time. People are no longer self-conscious. They're so engaged in what they're doing, they're not even thinking about themselves. Then, they have a challenge. They have something they want to do that they really want to get done. They have a skill set. They have feedback for that skill set. And what does that constitute? Something like a game, something like playing tennis. For a lot of people, reading a book is a form of flow. For other people, many aspects of work are a form of flow. Interestingly, when Csikszentmihalyi was studying this stuff way back even in the 60s and 70s, he found that people couldn't wait to get out of work and go home to their TV sets, but they didn't have flow experiences with their TV. They really weren't that happy with their TV. They really weren't that engaged with their TV. And what's the trick in this? Think about what flow activities are for you, and then try as much as you can to make your day full of them. Because when people have more flow activities through the day, they tend not only to be more productive, they also tend to be happier. And I was talking a bit before about Alzheimer's, and there's a lot of data coming out on Alzheimer's pretty much every month. But if you have a choice between doing Sudoku, crossword puzzles on one hand, or taking a walk on the other, what would you do? Walk, right. And why is that?
Why?
Yeah.
Because it keeps your flow going.
It not only does things in terms of arteries, but it turns out that if you can walk for 20 or 30 minutes, you're going to grow new brain cells. You're going to grow them in memory areas. You're going to grow them in the hippocampus. And you're going to be able to use them in the next few days. You're literally going to grow memory storage. You grow memory storage by physical activity. And people say to me, that's wild. You know, why is the same thing doesn't happen to me if I'm studying Mandarin Chinese or I'm doing partial differential equations? Think about it for a second. It's about information. When you walk across the street, you are facing not just 85-year-old drivers with macular degeneration. You're also moving in three-dimensional space, which demands a tremendous amount of change. All of that has to be coordinated between your muscles and your nerves and your brain. Not only that, but your immune system is then responding to hundreds of different fungi, hundreds of different allergens, hundreds of different bacteria. All of that is information. All that has to be processed. All that has to be remembered or forgotten. Most of it, we're not conscious of. But it's huge. That information network is really humming when you take a walk across the street. And it's humming so much, in my opinion, that you literally have to grow memory storage at night to keep it up. And sleep is critical for memory. And if you'll go to my website, there's a whole bunch of articles about sleep and memory, naps and memory. There's stuff that's just come out in the last week showing that when people were napping, they were effectively much faster at learning things, much better at learning things. It's all about regeneration. Okay. So, there's very simple things that you can do. You want to improve your memory? Yes, walk. But walk with friends, walk with colleagues, walk with people you know, walk in sunlight. Remember that light is a drug. Do the things that we evolved to do. Do the things that really regenerate us. And if you can, try to make life musical. You've got all these body clocks. You've got all these things going on through your day. Music has fast periods, slow periods. Symphony will have a fast movement, a slow movement. It'll have the beginnings and ends, which often redo each other. Think of doing that with your own day. Why do we like music so much? Stimulation. Right. Makes you feel happy. Rhythm, yeah. Music is in our genes. We are profoundly rhythmic animals. We don't like to talk to each other at 3 or 4 in the morning, most of us, but we're pretty darn alert in the evening. We're much better at moving at certain times of day than at other times of day. Use that rhythm. Use those rhythms, your own internal rhythms, to make your life more lyrical. And so the bottom line is that rest is regeneration. And what I was talking about before, this sort of information network that is your body, this giant information network, I'm talking about food, activity, rest, social engagement, flow. Flow is also about meaning and purpose and pleasure. And what's interesting is that they're all interconnected. And you'll see a lot of books where they'll say, okay, this is the diet you should eat, or this is the kind of exercise you should do, or this is the kind of rest, as in the power of rest, that you should do. But what's really interesting is the avenues of that information network are the connections between those. Because how you do physical activity will change with time of day. How you do physical activity will depend dramatically on whether you're doing it with someone else or you're doing it alone. How you do physical activity will change how you ingest your food, how you digest your food. All these things are connected. So if you can think about them, food, activity, rest, just simple idea of food, activity, rest, FAR, as one simple rhythm to the day. But then consider things like biological clocks. Consider things like social engagement. See the interconnections because, folks, that's what really keeps us healthy. It's not one thing, it's not two things, it's not three things. It's how they fit together. That's how we really regenerate. And if you have some basic ideas, as I hope you do now, of how your body really does work, you can put it together for yourself. Because that journey is an individual journey. It's not going to be the same even for identical twins. We're all going to have our own way of getting healthy, of living longer, of looking younger or looking more beautiful. Aging is a script. You're not going to change the script, but you can direct it differently. If you look at a Shakespeare play, you can set it in 1600 England, you can set it in 21st century America. You can do it very differently. You want to direct that script. That's what the Regeneration Project is about. Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure, verify that I heard you correctly. Our largest meal is our breakfast. Is that correct?
And my view is this. If, for example, the question is, should the largest meal of the day be breakfast? In theory, yes. When you give people one meal a day, 2,000 calories, give it to them in the morning, give it to them at lunch, give it to them in the evening. What do you think happens? If you give it to people in the morning, what happens to weight? Weight goes down. You give it to them at lunch, what happens? Stays the same, actually. If you give it to them at night, what happens? Goes up. Everything changes in time. Time rules life. But all this stuff is interconnected. And the interconnections actually make sense.
I have a further question. They talk about eating on a 9-inch plate now.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, modifying the amount that we eat. Do you agree with that?
Should we eat on larger plates or smaller plates? Depends on which friends you're with, actually. The question is, do we eat too much? Yes. The United States puts out about 4,000 calories a day or close to it. We really need probably somewhere between 2,000 and 2,400. But yeah, food is wild. I mean, there are so many ways that you can change people's ingestion. If you give people smaller plates, they eat less. If you give people a meal, basically if you give them a vegan meal with a lot of roughage at the beginning, and you give them the same 2,000 calories day in, day out, the people who have the roughage are going to eat 300 or 400 calories less. The brain responds to different information. When it sees all that roughage, it says, okay, there's enough food in there. Very different than a McDonald's hamburger. Very different than what you're going to get in fast food, where in many cases you're going to have a kind of hypoglycemic overhang, which in many cases makes people want to eat more. Okay, yeah.
So in some cultures, they eat salads at the end of a meal, and some, like we typically eat them at the beginning of a meal. Which is better?
I think it depends on what culture you come from. The question is, where's the best time in terms of having salads? And the reason I say that is because it's not that simple. Because food is celebration, food is pleasure, food is enjoyment, food is social engagement. And different cultures do it differently, all in many cases to their benefit. I mean, food is a really big part of any civilization. In theory, I would say have the salad first. Just like I would say, if you're going to have the dessert, have it at the end of the meal. But the real trick is enjoying that meal, knowing where it comes from, splicing it, dicing it, cooking it in a way where it's really tasty, and you enjoy the idea of using this to regenerate your body. Yeah?
So culturally, most Americans are not in position to make their breakfast the biggest meal of the day. And it bears on what you just talked about. We also use meal as socialization and also as a pleasurable sensory experience. And most Americans who are running off to work, it's not feasible for them to do that with breakfast. In practicality, do you have suggestions on how to engineer that? Because our culture completely flips what's healthy for us. We don't have time at breakfast, we don't have time at lunch. Dinner is when we've got time to make and ingest a big meal, and it's when we've got time to do it in a social way.
We don't have time to rest either. We don't have time for most anything. I think my answer in many cases is a lot of people come to me and say they never eat breakfast at all, so I say eat something. The question is usually the same. You are pragmatic, you do what you can. Think of it this way. If you can take the time, you want to eat a relatively big breakfast, you want to have a fair bit of roughage, you want to have a lot of different kinds of things, because at least if you look at the epidemiologic evidence, the population evidence, people tend to live longer when there's a lot of nutritional variety. I agree with the Japanese point of view where you put 5 colors on your plate and they don't mean Fruit Loops. Okay? But if you can and you have the time for breakfast, you eat a real breakfast, you eat some whole foods and you take the time for it. And if you don't, you don't. And then what a lot of people have found is there's nothing magically out there that says you have to have 3 meals a day. Some people eat 4 or 5 times a day and do far better that way. And I suspect that's going to vary from body to body. So if you can't get the stuff in at breakfast, fine, have a relatively large lunch. The real problems, I think, tend to occur more that people eat a very large part of their calories at night. That, I think, is really problematic. Yeah?
You mentioned vegan. Do you support or suggest a vegan or vegetarian diet
As opposed to what? You mean eating meat and potatoes with every meal?
Well, not meat and potatoes, but vegetarian over non-vegetarian.
I personally, yes. And I think, that becomes a moral and political and another argument. I'm a semi-vegetarian myself. Okay? And I think it would be fine to be a vegan. I just can't do that.
Not ethically, I'm not asking that question, but according to your book, your health, do you think it's a healthier lifestyle?
I think there's a lot of questions that it comes into. The whole question of vegetarianism, what's sustainable in this world? What's sustainable agriculture? What's sustainable food? Meat takes a tremendous amount of energy. We're looking now at huge energy prices. The population of the world is now 7 billion people. It's going to be 9 billion people. Where are you going to get all that food from? And so that also, to my mind at least, gets into that equation.
I agree with you, but I was just wondering health-wise.
Health-wise, I think you're better off eating mostly plant stuffs, yeah. And, Michael Pollan's one-sentence answers, and I mean, that's basically what the media want, is eat plants, leaves before seeds, not too much. I don't think that's bad advice. But I do believe that nutritional variety makes a huge difference. And different cultures will eat very different kinds of foods, and in many cases still be very healthy. Why? Food is not one substance. Any particular food is hundreds of different substances. Diets are not simple. They're incredibly complicated because you've got hundreds of different chemicals, many of which have drug-like effects, and then even how you sequence them will have different effects. So we try to think of nutrition as, proteins, carbohydrates. No, food is information. Food is much more complicated than that. Yeah.
On the rest aspect part of all this, when you hear that you're supposed to have 6 a.m. sleep, does that have to be uninterrupted?
No. The question is, do you have to have uninterrupted sleep through the night? In fact, biologically, we're probably set up to wake up in the middle of the night. If you look at 18th century, 17th century diaries, people would go to bed in darkness. They'd go to bed much earlier than us. They'd often wake up for an hour in the middle of the night, talk, do housework, do all kinds of things, then get up later. And they actually repeated that at the National Institutes of Mental Health under Tom Ware. And it was a wild study because it was one of those rare studies where people came to the investigators after it and said, we don't want this study to end. I mean, how many times does that happen? And the reason was interesting because people said, one, they never knew what it was like to be fully alert and fully awake until they had slept that way. And two, they also in many cases had mystical experiences. They started to feel a wholeness with the world and a wholeness with themselves. So yeah, rest matters. Rest doesn't just regenerate brain and tissue, rest regenerates mind.
Well, for years I worked for a living, and I would get up at 5:30, 6, 7 every morning, like clockwork. I really needed to set an alarm clock.
Right.
And when I went to bed, I went to sleep.
Right.
And I slept through the night. In the last few years, my husband has been inconsiderate enough to have a couple strokes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Needs my assistance at different times. And a lot of times I will go to bed, go to sleep, and I was being silly. I'm very happy that I'm able to take care of him. Anyhow, he will wake me up because he needs something, and I
Right.
get up and then I'm wide awake for a while.
Okay. If you really can't sleep, you can always read one of my books in the middle of the night.
I do a lot of reading, yes.
But there are many, many different tricks. But no, if you actually look at what happens to people in normal sleep, perfect sleepers, they wake up 15 to 25 times, but they're sufficiently short that they don't remember being awake. Now, my record in this was a woman who came into the sleep lab, and my chief tech did not want to study her because her main complaint was insomnia. I knew she had had a middle cerebral stroke years before, and I knew there was a very high rate of sleep apnea in that, and I said, trust me on this one. So she comes into the lab, goes to sleep, wakes up the next morning, and says to the lab technicians, that's the best sleep I've had in 4 years. They were horrified. She woke up 1,200 times. She woke up 1,200 times and thought she had slept through the whole night. The longest period of actual sleep that I could see on her record was 90 seconds. Okay, that was the best sleep she'd had in 4 years. If you take people and you put them in stage 1 sleep for 10 minutes, they did this at Henry Ford Hospital, 50% of them will tell you they were awake the whole time. And what the population has no idea of is that they're having microsleeps all over the place, including driving. They're out for 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds. They're clueless about this in many cases. Okay? This happens to pilots flying your plane all the time. We think that sleep and wake are completely separate phenomena. They're not. We're going in and out of them all over the place. And that's why it's a lot easier to get away from this idea that you have to have the, how can I describe it, lie down and die process that's supposed to be American sleep. You know, you go, you sit and you lie in your bed, you turn the light off, and just like a light switch you're out, and then the alarm goes on, and just like a light switch you're on. That's not how we do things at all. That's not how our bodies are built. We are built to move back and forth through different levels of consciousness, different levels of energy, different levels of activity, all through the 24-hour day. Yeah.
Do you think some people's body time rhythm would sleep better early in the evening, and some people can go to bed like at 2 and then have a great sleep?
Do people have different body rhythms? Absolutely. The question is, do people have different innate clocks? And the answer is absolutely they do. And what do owls and larks, night people and morning people have in common? They marry each other. And when they marry each other, guess what? Their divorce rates are higher. And when it starts to work is when they have children, because then somebody who's up late can deal with the kids at one point, and somebody who's up early can deal with the kids early. Yeah, larks and owls are really a genetic thing, and they're very, very powerfully affected throughout the society. I spent years trying to find a lark jazz musician, and I finally found one. He lasted about 1.5 to 2 years, and he says he just couldn't do it anymore, because when he wanted to go to sleep was when they would start playing. Yeah, time rules life, and our inner times are very different. Yes?
We lived in Alaska for a long time, and one of the things I remember about those years was that in the summertime, when it was daylight almost all the time, just different energy levels.
Yes.
And you seem to need a lot less sleep and stuff like that. In the wintertime, we hibernated.
I have a lot of family in Sweden. The question is what happens to people when there's very different light effects. It's even interesting here to live compared to New York, because this is much more equatorial. So you have less changes in light through the night and day than you do when you're up north. And as a result, you have a lot less seasonal depression down here. When you do have seasonal depression, guess what? It occurs in the summertime, as it's too hot and people don't go outside and open up their windows. But yeah, people will have completely different lives depending on where they are in the sun. The more sun that people tend to have, the better their mood. But in Sweden, they'll say, let them have their summer. That's when we do our living. And they really mean it. And they talk about the winter as the murky time. Okay, and we have a German here who's sort of nodding and has some idea of what that's all about. But that's what the Northern Hemisphere does, yes. Okay, yeah.
Roger, just have a question. If you're sleeping, I go to sleep early, I sleep for a few hours, I'm up, and I understand that you're awake and asleep during the night, but do you have suggestions for people who don't feel refreshed in the morning?
Yes. My suggestion for people who don't feel refreshed in the morning is buy my book. But beyond that, there's a lot of things. You have to ask yourself, are you getting enough time of sleep? Are you waking up too much? Are you getting as fit as you can be, because that usually will help you with sleep? And if there are things that are waking you up at night, if they're not related to sleep disorders like sleep apnea or leg kicks or weird confusional arousals, are you getting back to sleep quickly enough? And to get back to sleep quickly enough is a real problem, because there's a lot of middle insomnia, as it's called in the trade. There's a lot of people who wake up in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep. And there's a whole lot of different things you can do about that. So I did say before that I would talk about paradoxical relaxation, and at least two people are nodding their heads. Paradoxical relaxation was devised by a guy named Jakobson. And he was so good at it that, one, he made almost everybody else nervous. And two, he would go into a group like this, talk, sit down for a few minutes, and then people would come up to him and they thought he was a corpse. They thought he was dead. His body was completely flaccid. He was totally awake, totally alert, but they thought he was dead. So, how do you do paradoxical relaxation? You pay attention to one muscle group at a time. And he liked to start people with organs of speech. For example, if you really concentrate, you'll notice that the tips of your lips are fasciculating. They're actually moving around a bit. Now, let me just ask people here, is there a spot on your forehead, your neck, your head, any place where the muscle feels a little more tense than the one next to it? Okay? Yeah. Can you just point to that? Just point to a spot? Okay. Yeah. Some people can't point to a spot. All right. Most of the time you'll notice, if you close your eyes, that your eyes are jiggling. I wear glasses. This part of my eyebrow is usually a bit more tense than this part. Most of the time we'll have some cheek muscles that'll be a little tighter than the one next to it. So, okay, see if you can sit comfortably for a few seconds. Good. Now, the big problem with paradoxical relaxation is that when you do it right, some people fall asleep. So we'll see. But just close your eyes. Focus on that tiny spot where your muscle tension was a little higher than it was the area next to it. Now, just focus all your attention on that little tiny muscle. Don't tense it. Don't relax it. Just feel it. Just sense it. Just know it. If you want, you can visualize what that muscle looks like and how it's a little crunched up. But just feel that difference in muscle tension between that tiny muscle and the area around it. And just concentrate on feeling that muscle tension for the next 10-15 seconds. Okay, open your eyes. What did you notice?
Got smaller.
The area of tension got smaller. Did anybody notice anything else? What? Some people were going to sleep and it wasn't just the lecture. Okay.
I focused on it, I felt it just kind of
You just felt it dissolve?
I felt it released like a band.
You felt the area released like a band. Question, what happened to the rest of your body? Right. That's the paradox of paradoxical relaxation, folks. Paradoxical relaxation works by the area you're paying attention to withdrawing all that attention from the other groups of muscles. And as a result, by relaxing one tiny muscle, you end up relaxing the rest of your body. So what Jakobson used to do is he would go up and down the body, and he would do a muscle here and a muscle here and a muscle here. And after a while, it becomes like a weather map. And you can see, it's like those guys with the blue screens, that, we got, this is Lutz, and, there's some precipitation there. You can feel the tension in different parts of your body. And you use that by just focusing on the different parts one by one. And that is something that you can really use to fall asleep. And a lot of people, when they wake up in the middle of the night and they can't get back to sleep, if they can just do something like paradoxical relaxation, that will often work.
Have you heard of paradoxical intention?
Yes.
That works too.
Paradoxical intention can work, especially in politics, yes. Okay.
Is that why, like in yoga, sometimes there'd be like a guided meditation where they'll say, feel your toes, feel this, feel that?
Yoga has, 3,000 years worth of experience in looking at these things. But yes, if you can focus on one point, very often, if there's total focus on that one point, the rest of the body will relax. But as I say, there's dozens of different ways of resting. I mean, there's different ways of doing self-hypnosis, there's different ways of doing deep breathing, and you can mix and match and fit these all into yourself, all into a normal day. That's what you can do with rest. And rest is a much bigger topic than sleep, because rest is all about how you're going to, unconsciously in most cases, regenerate your body. My point is that you can do it consciously. You can go out and take a walk. You can go out and call someone. You can go visit. You can do paradoxical relaxation, even in the middle of your day. I will do it on a lunch line. I will do it when I'm on a bank line. I will do it in an elevator. I will do it for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, just to get my body in the zone. Because it becomes incredibly fast when you do it after a while. Okay.
What are your thoughts on meditation?
Meditation, the question is, what are my thoughts on meditation? Meditation is basically a form of spiritual rest, of which there are thousands of different types across many different cultures, which works very well for a heck of a lot of people. So that's one of those forms of rest that's been around. And if you'll look, the idea of active rest has actually been there in cultures all over the place for millennia. But people have not thought of rest as an active principle. They haven't thought of rest as something that regenerates the body, except when they're doing things like meditation. Okay.
We're going to have to wrap it up, actually.
Yes.